8. A week later, Alec Mackenzie and George Allerton started from Charing Cross. They were to go by P&O from Marseille to Aden, and there catch a German boat which would take them to Mombasa. Lady Kelsey was far too distressed to see her nephew off, and Lucy was glad, since it gave her the chance of driving to the station alone with George. She found Dick Lomas and Mrs. Crowley already there. When the train steamed away, Lucy was standing a little apart from the others. She was quite still. She did not even wave her hand, and there was little expression on her face. Mrs. Crowley was crying cheerfully, and she dried her eyes with a tiny handkerchief. Lucy turned to her and thanked her for coming. "Shall I drive you back in the carriage?" sobbed Mrs. Crowley. "I think I'll take a cab, if you don't mind," Lucy answered quietly. "Perhaps you'll take Dick." She did not bid them goodbye, but walked slowly away. "How exasperating you people are!" cried Mrs. Crowley. "I wanted to throw myself in her arms and have a good cry on the platform. You have no heart." Dick walked along by her side, and they got into Mrs. Crowley's carriage. She soliloquized. "I thank God that I have emotions, and I don't mind if I do show them. I was the only person who cried. I knew I should cry, and I brought 3 handkerchiefs on purpose. Look at them." She pulled them out of her bag and thrust them into Dick's hand. "They're soaking." "You say it with triumph," he smiled. "I think you're all perfectly heartless. Those 2 boys were going away for heaven, knows how long, on a dangerous journey, and they may never come back, and you and Lucy said goodbye to them, just as if they were going off for a day's golf. I was the only one who said I was sorry, and that we should miss them dreadfully. I hate this English coldness. When I go to America, it's 10 to 1 nobody comes to see me off, and if anyone does, he just nods and says, 'Goodbye, I hope you'll have a jolly time.' Next time you go, I will come and hurl myself on the ground and gnash my teeth and shriek at the top of my voice. Oh yes, do. And then I'll cry all the way to Liverpool, and I shall have a racking headache and feel quite miserable and happy." Dick meditated for a moment. "You see, we have an instinctive horror of exhibiting our emotion. I don't know why it is. I suppose training or the inheritance of our sturdy fathers. But we're ashamed to let people see what we feel. But I don't know whether on that account our feelings are any the less keen. Don't you think there's a certain beauty in a grief that forbids itself all expression? You know, I admire Lucy tremendously, and as she came towards us on the platform, I thought there was something very fine in her calmness." "Fiddlesticks," said Mrs. Crowley sharply. "I should have liked her much better if she had clung to her brother and sobbed and had to be torn away. Did you notice that she left us without even shaking hands? It was a very small omission, but it meant that she was quite absorbed in her grief." They reached Mrs. Crowley's tiny house in Norfolk Street, and she asked Dick to come in. "Sit down and read the paper," she said, "while I go and powder my nose." Dick made himself comfortable. He blessed the charming woman when a butler of imposing dimensions brought in all that was necessary to make a cocktail. Mrs. Crowley cultivated England like a museum specimen. She had furnished her drawing-room with Chippendale furniture of an exquisite pattern. No chintzes were so smartly calendared as hers, and on the walls were mezzotints of the ladies whom Sir Joshua had painted. The chimney-piece was adorned with Lowestoft china, and on the silver table was a collection of old English spoons. She had chosen her butler because he went so well with the house. His respectability was portentous, his gravity was never disturbed by the shadow of a smile, and Mrs. Crowley treated him as though he were a piece of decoration, with an impertinence that fascinated him. He looked upon her as an outlandish freak, but his heavy British heart was surrendered to her entirely, and he watched over her with a solicitude that amused and touched her. Dick thought that the little drawing-room was very comfortable, and when Mrs. Crowley returned, after an unconscionable time at the toilet table, he was in the happiest mood. She gave a rapid glance at the glasses. "You're a perfect hero," she said. "You've waited till I came down to have your cocktail." "Richard Lomas, madam, is the soul of courtesy," he replied with a flourish. "Besides, base is the soul that drinks in the morning by himself. At night, in your slippers and without a collar, with a pipe in your mouth and a good book in your hand, a solitary glass of whiskey and soda is eminently desirable. But the anteprandial cocktail needs the sparkle of conversation." "You seem to be in excellent health," said Mrs. Crowley. "I am. Why?" "I saw in yesterday's paper that your doctor had ordered you to go abroad for the rest of the winter." "My doctor received the 2 guineas, and I wrote the prescription," returned Dick. "Do you remember that I explained to you the other day at length my intention of retiring into private life?" "I do. I strongly disapprove of it." "Well, I was convinced that if I relinquished my duties without any excuse, people would say I was mad and shut me up in a lunatic asylum. I invented a breakdown in my health, and everything is plain sailing. I've got a pair for the rest of the session, and at the general election the excellent Robert Boulger will step into my unworthy shoes." "And supposing you regret the step you've taken?" "In my youth I imagined, with the romantic fervor of my age, that in life everything was irreparable. That is a delusion. One of the greatest advantages of life is that hardly anything is. One can make ever so many fresh starts. The average man lives long enough for a good many experiments, and it's they that give life its savor." "I don't approve of this flippant way you talk of life," said Mrs. Crowley severely. "It seems to me something infinitely serious and complicated." "That is an illusion of moralists. As a matter of fact, it's merely what you make it. Mine is quite light and simple." Mrs. Crowley looked at Dick reflectively. "I wonder why you never married," she said. "I can tell you easily. Because I have a considerable gift for repartee. I discovered in my early youth that men propose not because they want to marry, but because on certain occasions they are entirely at a loss for topics of conversation." "It was a momentous discovery," she smiled. "No sooner had I made it than I began to cultivate my powers of small talk. I felt that my only chance was to be ready with appropriate subjects at the smallest notice, and I spent a considerable part of my last year at Oxford in studying the best masters." "I never noticed that you were particularly brilliant," murmured Mrs. Crowley, raising her eyebrows. "I never played for brilliancy, I played for safety. I flatter myself that when prattle was needed, I have never been found wanting. I have met the ingenuousness of sweet 17 with a few observations on free trade, while the haggard efforts of 30 have struggled in vain against a brief exposition of the higher philosophy. When people talk higher philosophy to me, I make it a definite rule to blush," said Mrs. Crowley. "The skittish widow of uncertain age has retired in disorder before a complete acquaintance with the Restoration dramatists, and I have frequently routed the serious spinster with religious leanings by my remarkable knowledge of the results of missionary endeavor in Central Africa. Once a dowager sought to ask me my intentions, but I flung at her astonished head an article from the Encyclopedia Britannica. An American divorcee swooned when I poured into her shell-like ear a few facts about the McKinley tariff. These are only my serious efforts. I need not tell you how often I have evaded a flash of the eyes by an epigram or ignored a sigh by an apt quotation from the poets." "I don't believe a word you say," retorted Mrs. Crowley. "I believe you never married for the simple reason that nobody would have you. Do me the justice to acknowledge that I'm the only man who's known you for 10 days without being tempted by those coal mines of yours in Pennsylvania to offer you his hand and heart." "I don't believe the coal has anything to do with it," answered Mrs. Crowley. I put it down entirely to my very considerable personal attractions." Dick looked at the time and found that the cocktail had given him an appetite. He asked Mrs. Crowley if she would lunch with him, and gaily they set out for a fashionable restaurant. Neither of them gave a thought to Alec and George speeding towards the unknown, nor to Lucy shut up in her room, given over to utter misery. For Lucy, it was the first of many dreary days. Dick went to Naples, and enjoying his new-won idleness, did not even write to her. Mrs. Crowley, after deciding on a trip to Egypt, was called to America by the illness of a sister, and Lady Kelsey, unable to stand the rigour of a northern winter, set out for Nice. Lucy refused to accompany her. Though she knew it would be impossible to see her father, she could not bear to leave England, she could not face the gay people who thronged the Riviera while he was bound to degrading tasks. The luxury of her own life horrified her when she compared it with his hard fare, and she could not look upon the comfortable rooms she lived in, with their delicate refinements, without thinking of the bare cell to which he was confined. Lucy was glad to be alone. She went nowhere but passed her days in solitude, striving to acquire peace of mind. She took long walks in the parks with her dogs and spent much time in the picture galleries. Without realizing the effect they had upon her, she felt vaguely the calming influence of beautiful things. Often she would sit in the National Gallery before some royal picture, and the joy of it would fill her soul with quiet relief. Sometimes she would go to those majestic statues that decorated the pediment of the Parthenon, and the tears welled up in her clear eyes as she thanked the gods for the graciousness of their peace. She did not often listen to music, for then she could remain no longer mistress of her emotions. The tumultuous sounds of a symphony, the final anguish of Tristan, made vain all her efforts at self-control, and when she got home, she could only throw herself on her bed and weep passionately. In reading, she found her greatest solace. Many things that Alec had said returned dimly to her memory, and she began to read the Greek writers who had so profoundly affected him. She found a translation of Euripides which gave her some impression of the original, and her constant mood was answered by those old, exquisite tragedies. The complexity of that great poet, his doubt, despair, and his love of beauty spoke to her heart as no modern writer could. And in the study of those sad deeds, in which men seemed always playthings of the fates, she found a relief to her own keen sorrow. She did not reason it out with herself, but almost unconsciously the thought came to her that the slings and arrows of the gods could be transformed into beauty by resignation and courage. Nothing was irreparable but a man's own weakness, and even in shame, disaster, and poverty, it was possible to lead a life that was not without grandeur. The man who was beaten to the ground by an outrageous fortune might be a finer thing than the unseeing, cruel powers that conquered him. It was in this wise that Lucy battled with the intolerable shame that oppressed her. In that quiet corner of Hampshire, in which her early years had been spent, among the memories of her dead kindred, the pride of her race had grown to unreasonable proportions, and now, in the reaction, she was terrified lest its decadence was in her, too, and in George. She could do nothing but suffer whatever pain it pleased the gods to send. But George was a man. In him were placed all her hopes. But now and again, wild panic seized her. Then the agony was too great to bear, and she pressed her hands to her eyes in order to drive away the hateful thought. What if George failed her? She knew well enough that he had his father's engaging ways and his father's handsome face, but his father had had a smile as frank and a charm as great. What if with the son, too, they betokened only insincerity and weakness? A malicious devil whispered in her ear that now and again she had averted her eyes in order not to see George do things she hated. But it was youth, that drove him. She had taken care to keep from him knowledge of the sordid struggles that occupied her, and how could she wonder if he was reckless and uncaring? She would not doubt him. She could not doubt him, for if anything went wrong with him, there was no hope left. She could only cease to believe in herself. When Lucy was allowed to write to her father, she set herself to cheer him. The thought that over 5 years must elapse before she would have him by her side once more paralyzed her pen. But she would not allow herself to be discouraged, and she sought to give courage to him. She wanted him to see that her love was undiminished and that he could count on it. Presently, she received a letter from him. After a few weeks, the unaccustomed food, the change of life, had told upon him, and a general breakdown in his health had driven him into the infirmary. Lucy was thankful for the respite which his illness afforded. It must be a little less dreary in a prison hospital than in a prison cell. A letter came from George and another from Alec. Alec's was brief, telling of their journey down the Red Sea and their arrival at Mombasa. It was abrupt and awkward, making no reference to his love or to the engagement which he had almost promised to make when he returned. He began and ended quite formally. George, apparently in the best of spirits, wrote as he always did in a boyish, inconsequent fashion. His letter was filled with slang and gave no news. There was little to show that it was written from Mombasa, on the verge of a dangerous expedition into the interior, rather than from Oxford on the eve of a football match. But she read them over and over again. They were very matter-of-fact, and she smiled as she thought of Julia Crowley's indignation if she had seen them. From her recollection of Alec's words, Lucy tried to make out the scene that first met her brother's eyes. She seemed to stand by his side, leaning over the rail as the ship approached the harbour. The sea was blue with a blue she had never seen, and the sky was like an inverted bowl of copper. The low shore, covered with bush, stretched away in the distance. A line of waves was breaking on the reef. They came in sight of the island of Mombasa, with the overgrown ruins of a battery that had once commanded the entrance, and there were white-roofed houses with deep verandas, which stood in little clearings with coral cliffs below them. On the opposite shore, thick groves of palm trees rose with their singular, melancholy beauty. Then, as the channel narrowed, they passed an old Portuguese fort which carried the mind back to the bold adventurers who had first sailed those distant seas, and directly afterwards a mass of white buildings that reached to the edge of the lapping waves. They saw the huts of the native town, wattled and thatched, nestling close together, and below them was a fleet of native craft. On the jetty was the African crowd, shouting and jostling, some half-naked and some strangely clad, Arabs from across the sea, Swahilis, and here and there a native from the interior. In course of time, other letters came from George, but Alec wrote no more. The days passed slowly. Lady Kelsey returned from the Riviera. Dick came back from Naples to enjoy the pleasures of the London season. He appeared thoroughly to enjoy his idleness, signally falsifying the predictions of those who had told him that it was impossible to be happy without regular work. Mrs. Crowley settled down once more in her house in Norfolk Street. During her absence, she had written reams by every post to Lucy, and Lucy had looked forward very much to seeing her again. The little American was almost the only one of her friends with whom she did not feel shy. The apartness which her nationality gave her made Mrs. Crowley more easy to talk to. She was too fond of Lucy to pity her. The general election came before it was expected, and Robert Bulger succeeded to the seat which Dick Lomas was only too glad to vacate. Bobby was very charming. He surrounded Lucy with a protecting care, and she could not fail to be touched by his entire devotion. When he thought she had recovered somewhat from the first blow of her father's sentence, he sent her a letter in which once more he besought her to marry him. She was grateful to him for having chosen that method of expressing himself, for it seemed possible in writing to tell him with greater tenderness that if she could not accept his love, she deeply valued his affection. It seemed to Lucy that the life she led in London, or at Lady Kelsey's house on the river, was no more than a dream. She was but a figure in the procession of shadow pictures cast on a sheet in a fair, and nothing that she did signified. Her spirit was away in the heart of Africa, and by a vehement effort of her fancy she sought to see what each day her friend and her brother were doing. Now they had long left the railway and such civilization as was to be found in the lands where white men had already made their mark. She knew the exultation which Alec felt, and the thrill of independence when he left behind him all traces of it. He held himself more proudly because he knew that thenceforward he must rely on his own resources, and success or failure depended only on himself. Often as she lay awake and saw the ghostly dawn steal across the sky, she seemed born to the African camp, where the break of day, like a gust of wind in a field of ripe corn, brought a sudden stir among the sleepers. Alec had described to her so minutely the changing scene that she was able to bring it vividly before her eyes. She saw him come out of his tent, in heavy boots, buckling on his belt. He wore knee breeches and a pith helmet, and he was more bronzed than when she had bidden him farewell. He gave the order to the headman of the caravan to take up the loads. At the word, there was a rush from all parts of the camp. Each porter seized his load, carrying it off to lash on his mat and his cooking pot, and then, sitting upon it, ate a few grains of roasted maize or the remains of last night's game. And as the sun appeared above the horizon, Alec, as was his custom, led the way, followed by a few askari. A band of natives struck up a strange and musical chant, and the camp, but now a scene of busy life, was deserted. The smouldering fires died out with the rising sun, and the silent life of the forest replaced the chatter and the hum of humankind. Giant beetles came from every quarter and carried away pieces of offal. Small, shy beasts stole out to gnaw the white bones upon which savage teeth had left but little. A gaunt hyena, with suspicious looks, snatched at a bone and dashed back into the jungle. Vultures settled down heavily and with deliberate air sought out the foulest refuse. Then Lucy followed Alec upon his march, with his fighting men and his long string of porters. They went along a narrow track, pushing their way through bushes and thorns or tall rank grass, sometimes with difficulty forcing through elephant reeds which closed over their heads and showered the cold dew down on their faces. Sometimes they passed through villages with rich soil and extensive population. Sometimes they plunged into heavy forests of gigantic trees, festooned with creepers, where the silence was unbroken even by the footfall of the traveller on the bottomless carpet of leaves. Sometimes they traversed vast swamps, hurrying to avoid the deadly fever, and sometimes scrub jungles, in which, as far as the eye could reach, was a forest of cactus and thorn bush. Sometimes they made their way through grassy uplands with trees as splendid as those of an English park, and sometimes they toiled painfully along a game track that ran by the bank of a swift-rushing river. At midday a halt was called. The caravan had opened out by then. Men who were sick or had stopped to adjust a load, others who were weak or lazy, had lagged behind. But at last they were all there. And the rearguard, perhaps with George in charge of it, whose orders were on no account to allow a single man to remain behind them, reported that no one was missing. During the heat of noon, they made fires and cooked food. Presently, they set off once more and marched till sundown. When they reached the place which had been fixed on for camping, a couple of shots were fired as signals, and soon the natives, men and women, began to stream in with little baskets of grain or flour, with potatoes and chickens and perhaps a pot or two of honey. Very quickly the tents were pitched, the bed gear arranged, the loads counted and stacked. The party whose duty it was to construct the zeriba cut down boughs and dragged them in to form a fence. Each little band of men selected the site for their bivouac. One went off to collect materials to build the huts, another to draw water, a third for firewood and stones on which to place the cooking pot. At sunset, the headman blew his whistle and asked if all were present. A lusty chorus replied. He reported to his chief and received the orders for the next day's march. Alec had told Lucy that from the cry that goes up in answer to the headman's whistle, you could always gauge the spirit of the men. If game had been shot, or from scarcity the caravan had come to a land of plenty, there was a perfect babel of voices. But if the march had been long and hard, or if food had been issued for a number of days, of which this was the last, isolated voices replied, and perhaps one, bolder than the rest, cried out, "I am hungry." Then Alec and George and the others sat down to their evening meal, while the porters, in little parties, were grouped around their huge pots of porridge. A little chat, a smoke, an exchange of sporting anecdotes, and the white men turned in. And Alec, gazing on the embers of his campfire, was alone with his thoughts. The silence of the night was upon him, and he looked up at the stars that shone in their countless myriads in the blue African sky. Lucy got up and stood at her open window. She, too, looked up at the sky, and she thought that she saw the same stars as he did. Now, in that last half-hour, free from the burden of the day, with everyone at rest, he could give himself over to his thoughts, and his thoughts surely were of her. And during the months that had passed since Alec left England, Lucy's love had grown. In her solitude, there was nothing else to give brightness to her life, and little by little it filled her heart. Her nature was so strong that she could do nothing by half measures, and it was with a feeling of extreme relief that she surrendered herself to this overwhelming passion. It seemed to her that she was growing in a different direction. The yearning of her soul for someone on whom to lean was satisfied at last. Hitherto, the only instincts that had been fostered in her were those that had been useful to her father and George. They had needed her courage and her self-reliance. It was very comfortable to depend entirely upon Alec's love. Here she could be weak, here she could find a greater strength which made her own seem puny. Lucy's thoughts were absorbed in the man whom really she knew so little. She exulted in his unselfish striving and in his firmness of purpose, and when she compared herself with him, she felt unworthy. She treasured every recollection she had of him. She went over in her mind all that she had heard him say and reconstructed the conversations they had had together. She walked where they had walked, remembering how the sky had looked on those days and what flowers then bloomed in the parks. She visited the galleries they had seen in one another's company and stood before the pictures which he had lingered at. And notwithstanding all there was to torment and humiliate her, she was happy. Something had come into her life which made all else tolerable. It was easy to bear the extremity of grief when he loved her. After a long time, Dick received a letter from Alec. Mackenzie was not a good letter writer. He had no gift of self-expression, and when he had a pen in his hand, seemed to be seized with an invincible shyness. The letter was dry and wooden. It was dated from the last trading station before he set out into the wild country which was to be the scene of his operations. It said that hitherto everything had gone well with him, and the white men, but for fever occasionally, were bearing the climate well. One, named McInnery, had made a nuisance of himself and had been sent back to the coast. Alec gave no reasons for this step. He had been busy making the final arrangements. A company had been formed, the Northeast Africa Trading Company, to exploit the commercial possibilities of these unworked districts, and a charter had been given them. But the unsettled state of the land had so hampered them that the directors had gladly accepted Alec's offer to join their forces with his, and the traders at their stations had been instructed to take service under him. This increased the white men under his command to 16. He had drilled the Swahilis whom he had brought from the coast and given them guns, so that he had now an armed force of 400 men. He was collecting levies from the native tribes, and he gave the outlandish names of the chiefs armed with spears who were to accompany him. The power of Mohammed the Lam was on the wane, for during the 3 months which Alec had spent in England, an illness had seized him, which the natives asserted was a magic spell cast on him by one of his wives, and a son of his, taking advantage of this, had revolted and fortified himself in a stockade. The dying sultan had taken the field against him, and this division of forces made Alec's position immeasurably stronger. Dick handed Lucy the letter and watched her while she read it. "He says nothing about George," he said. "He's evidently quite well." Though it seemed strange that Alec made no mention of the boy, Dick said no more. Lucy appeared to be satisfied, and that was the chief thing. But he could not rid his mind of a certain uneasiness. He had received with misgiving Lucy's plan that George should accompany Alec. He could not help wondering whether those frank blue eyes and that facile smile did not conceal a nature as shallow as Fred Allerton's. But after all, it was the boy's only chance, and he must take it. Then an immense silence followed. Alec disappeared into those unknown countries as a man disappears into the night, and no more was heard of him. None knew how he fared. Not even a rumor reached the coast of success or failure. When he had crossed the mountains that divided the British protectorate from the lands that were to all intents independent, he vanished with his followers from human ken. The months passed, and there was nothing. It was a year now since he had arrived at Mombasa, then it was a year since the last letter had come from him. It was only possible to guess that behind those gaunt rocks, fierce battles were fought, new lands explored, and the slavers beaten back, foot by foot. Dick sought to persuade himself that the silence was encouraging, for it seemed to him that if the expedition had been cut to pieces, the rejoicing of the Arabs would have spread itself abroad, and some news of a disaster would have travelled through Somaliland to the coast, or been carried by traders to Zanzibar. He made frequent inquiries at the Foreign Office, but there, too, nothing was known. The darkness had fallen upon them, but Lucy suffered neither from anxiety nor fear. She had an immense confidence in Alec, and she believed in his strength, his courage, and his star. He had told her that he would not return till he had accomplished his task, and she expected to hear nothing till he had brought it to a triumphant conclusion. She did her little to help him, for at length the directors of the North East Africa Trading Company, growing anxious, proposed to get a question asked in Parliament, or to start an outcry in the newspapers which should oblige the government to send out a force to relieve Alec if he were in difficulties, or avenge him if he were dead. But Lucy knew that there was nothing Alec dreaded more than official interference. He was convinced that if this work could be done at all, he alone could do it, and she influenced Robert Bolger and Dick Lomas to use such means as they could to prevent anything from being done. She was certain that all Alec needed was time and a free hand. 9D. But the monotonous round of Lucy's life, with its dreams and its fond imaginings, was interrupted by news of a different character. An official letter came to her from Parkhurst to say that the grave state of her father's health had decided the authorities to remit the rest of his sentence, and he would be set free the next day, but one at 8 o'clock in the morning. She knew not whether to feel relief or sorrow. For if she was thankful that the wretched man's long torture was ended, she could not but realize that his liberty was given him only because he was dying. Mercy had been shown him, and Fred Allerton, in sight of a freedom from which no human laws could bar him, was given up to die among those who loved him. Lucy went down immediately to the Isle of Wight, and there engaged rooms in the house of a woman who had formerly served her at Hamlin's Purlieu. It was midwinter, and a cold drizzle was falling when she waited for him at the prison gates. 3 years had passed since they had parted. She took him in her arms and kissed him silently. Her heart was too full for words. A carriage was waiting for them, and she drove to the lodging-house. Breakfast was ready, and Lucy had seen that good things which he liked should be ready for him to eat. Fred Allerton looked wistfully at the clean tablecloth and at the flowers and the dainty scones, but he shook his head. He did not speak, and the tears ran slowly down his cheeks. He sank wearily into a chair. Lucy tried to induce him to eat. She brought him a cup of tea, but he put it away. He looked at her with haggard, bloodshot eyes. "Give me the flowers," he muttered. They were his first words. There was a large bowl of daffodils in the middle of the table, and she took them out of the water, deftly dried their stalks, and gave them to him. He took them with trembling hands and pressed them to his heart. Then he buried his face in them, and the tears ran afresh, bedewing the yellow flowers. Lucy put her arm around her father's neck and placed her cheek against his. "Don't, father," she whispered. "You must try and forget." He leaned back, exhausted, and the pretty flowers fell at his feet. "You know why they've let me out?" he said. She kissed him, but did not answer. "I'm so glad that we're together again," she murmured. "It's because I'm going to die." "No, you mustn't die. In a little while you'll get strong again. You have many years before you, and you'll be very happy." He gave her a long, searching look, and when he spoke, his voice had a hollowness in it that was strangely terrifying. "Do you think I want to live?" The pain seemed almost greater than Lucy could bear, and for a moment she had to remain silent so that her voice might grow steady. "You must live for my sake. Don't you hate me?" he asked. "No, I love you more than I ever did. I shall never cease to love you." "I suppose no one would marry you while I was in prison." His remark was so inconsequent that Lucy found nothing to say. He gave a bitter, short laugh. "I ought to have shot myself. Then people would have forgotten all about it, and you might have had a chance. Why didn't you marry Bobby?" "I haven't wanted to marry." He was so tired that he could only speak a little at a time, and now he closed his eyes. Lucy thought that he was dozing, and began to pick up the fallen flowers, but he noticed what she was doing. "Let me hold them," he moaned, with the pleading quaver of a sick child. As she gave them to him once more, he took her hands and began to caress them. "The only thing for me is to hurry up and finish with life. I'm in the way. Nobody wants me, and I shall only be a burden. I didn't want them to let me go. I wanted to die there quietly." Lucy sighed deeply. She hardly recognized her father in the bent, broken man who was sitting beside her. He had aged very much and seemed now to be an old man, but it was a premature aging, and there was a horror in it as of a process contrary to nature. He was very thin, and his hands trembled constantly. Most of his teeth had gone, his cheeks were sunken, and he mumbled his words so that it was difficult to distinguish them. There was no light in his eyes, and his short hair was quite white. Now and again he was shaken with a racking cough, and this was followed by an attack of such pain in his heart that it was anguish even to watch it. The room was warm, but he shivered with cold and cowered over the roaring fire. When the doctor whom Lucy had sent for saw him, he could only shrug his shoulders. I'm afraid nothing can be done, he said. His heart is all wrong, and he's thoroughly broken up. Is there no chance of recovery? I'm afraid all we can do is to alleviate the pain. And how long can he live? It's impossible to say. He may die tomorrow. He may last 6 months. The doctor was an old man, and his heart was touched by the sight of Lucy's grief. He had seen more cases than one of this kind. He doesn't want to live. It will be a mercy when death releases him. Lucy did not answer. When she returned to her father, she could not speak. He was apathetic and did not ask what the doctor had said. Lady Kelsey, hating the thought of Lucy and her father living amid the discomfort of furnished lodgings, had written to offer the use of her house in Charles Street, and Mrs. Crowley, in case they wanted complete solitude, had put Court Leys at their disposal. Lucy waited a few days to see whether her father grew stronger, but no change was apparent in him, and it seemed necessary at last to make some decision. She put before him the alternative plans, but he would have none of them. "Then would you rather stay here?" she said. He looked at the fire and did not answer. Lucy thought the sense of her question had escaped him, for often it appeared to her that his mind wandered. She was on the point of repeating it when he spoke. "I want to go back to the Purlieu." Lucy stifled a gasp of dismay. She stared at the wretched man. Had he forgotten? He thought that the house of his fathers was his still, and all that had parted him from it was gone from his memory. How could she tell him? "I want to die in my own home," he faltered. Lucy was in a turmoil of anxiety. She must make some reply. What he asked was impossible, and yet it was cruel to tell him the whole truth. "There are people living there," she answered. "Are there?" he said indifferently. He looked at the fire still. The silence was dreadful. "When can we go?" he said at last. "I want to get there quickly." Lucy hesitated. "We shall have to go into rooms." "I don't mind." He seemed to take everything as a matter of course. It was clear that he had forgotten the catastrophe that had parted him from Hamlin's Purlieu, and yet, strangely, he asked no questions. Lucy was tortured by the thought of revisiting the place she loved so well. She had been able to deaden her passionate regret only by keeping her mind steadfastly averted from all thoughts of it, and now she must actually go there. The old wounds would be opened. But it was impossible to refuse, and she set about making the necessary arrangements. The rector, who had been given the living by Fred Allerton, was an old friend, and Lucy knew that she could trust in his affection. She wrote and told him that her father was dying and had set his heart on seeing once more his old home. She asked him to find rooms in one of the cottages. She did not mind how small nor how humble they were. The rector answered by telegram. He begged Lucy to bring her father to stay with him. She would be more comfortable than in lodgings, and since he was a bachelor, there was plenty of room in the large rectory. Lucy, immensely touched by his kindness, gratefully accepted the invitation. Next day, they took the short journey across the Solent. The rector had been a don, and Fred Allerton had offered him the living in accordance with the family tradition that required a man of attainments to live in the neighboring rectory. He had been there now for many years, a spare, grey-haired, gentle creature who lived the life of a recluse in that distant village, doing his duty exactly, but given over for the most part to his beloved books. He seldom went away. The monotony of his daily round was broken only by the occasional receipt of a parcel of musty volumes, which he had ordered to be bought for him at some sale. He was a man of varied learning, full of remote information, eccentric from his solitariness, but with a great sweetness of nature. His life was simple, and his wants were few. In this house, in rooms lined from floor to ceiling with old books, Lucy and her father took up their abode. It seemed that Fred Allerton had been kept up only by the desire to get back to his native place, for he had no sooner arrived than he grew much worse. Lucy was busily occupied with nursing him and could give no time to the regrets which she had imagined would assail her. She spent long hours in her father's room, and while he dozed, half comatose, the kindly parson sat by the window and read to her in a low voice from queer, forgotten works. One day, Allerton appeared to be far better. For a week, he had wandered much in his mind, and more than once Lucy had suspected that the end was near. But now he was singularly lucid. He wanted to get up, and Lucy felt it would be brutal to balk any wish he had. He asked if he might go out. The day was fine and warm. It was February, and there was a feeling in the air as if the spring were at hand. In sheltered places, the snowdrops and the crocuses gave the garden the blitheness of an Italian picture, and you felt that on that multicolored floor might fitly trip the delicate angels of Messer Perugino. The rector had an old pony chaise in which he was used to visit his parishioners, and in this all three drove out. "Let us go down to the marshes," said Allerton. They drove slowly along the winding road till they came to the broad salt marshes. Beyond glittered the placid sea. There was no wind. Near them a cow looked up from her grazing and lazily whisked her tail. Lucy's heart began to beat more quickly. She felt that her father, too, looked upon that scene as the most typical of his home. Other places had broad acres and fine trees. Other places had forest land and purple heather. But there was something in those green flats that made them seem peculiarly their own. She took her father's hand, and silently their eyes looked onwards. A more peaceful look came into Fred Allerton's worn face, and the sigh that broke from him was not altogether of pain. Lucy prayed that it might still remain hidden from him that those fair, broad fields were his no longer. That night she had an intuition that death was at hand. Fred Allerton was very silent. Since his release from prison he had spoken barely a dozen sentences a day, and nothing served to wake him from his lethargy. But there was a curious restlessness about him now, and he would not go to bed. He sat in an armchair and begged them to draw it near the window. The sky was cloudless, and the moon shone brightly. Fred Allerton could see the great old elms that surrounded Hamlin's purlieu, and his eyes were fixed steadily upon them. Lucy saw them too, and she thought sadly of the garden which she had loved so well, and of the dear trees which old masters of the place had tended so lovingly. Her heart filled when she thought of the grey stone house and its happy, spacious rooms. Suddenly there was a sound, and she looked up quickly. Her father's head had fallen back, and he was breathing with a strange noisiness. She called her friend. "I think the end has come at last," she said. "Would you like me to fetch the doctor?" "It will be useless." The rector looked at the man's wan face, lit dimly by the light of the shaded lamp, and falling on his knees, began to recite the prayers for the dying. A shiver passed through Lucy. In the farmyard, a cock crew, and in the distance another cock answered cheerily. Lucy put her hand on the good rector's shoulder. "It's all over," she whispered. She bent down and kissed her father's eyes. A week later, Lucy took a walk by the seashore. They had buried Fred Allerton 3 days before among the ancestors whom he had dishonored. It was a lonely funeral, for Lucy had asked Robert Bulger, her only friend then in England, not to come, and she was the solitary mourner. The coffin was lowered into the grave, and the rector read the sad, beautiful words of the burial service. She could not grieve. Her father was at peace. She could only hope that his errors and his crimes would be soon forgotten, and perhaps those who had known him would remember then that he had been a charming friend, and a clever, sympathetic companion. It was little enough in all conscience that Lucy asked. On the morrow she was leaving the roof of the hospitable parson, surmising her wish to walk alone once more through the country which was so dear to her. He had not offered his company. Lucy's heart was full of sadness, but there was a certain peace in it too. The peace of her father's death had entered into her, and she experienced a new feeling, the feeling of resignation. Now her mind was set upon the future, and she was filled with hope. She stood by the water's edge, looking upon the sea as 3 years before, when she was staying at Court Leys, she had looked upon the sea that washed the shores of Kent. Many things had passed since then, and many griefs had fallen upon her. But for all that she was happier than then, since on that distant day, and it seemed ages ago, there had been scarcely a ray of brightness in her life, and now she had a great love which made every burden light. Low clouds hung upon the sky, and on the horizon the greyness of the heavens mingled with the greyness of the sea. She looked into the distance with longing eyes. Now all her life was set upon that far-off corner of unknown Africa, where Alec and George were doing great deeds. She wondered what was the meaning of the silence which had covered them so long. "Oh, if I could only see," she murmured. She sent her spirit upon that vast journey, trying to pierce the realms of space, but her spirit came back baffled. She could not know what they were at. If Lucy's love had been able to bridge the abyss that parted them, if in some miraculous way she had been able to see what actions they did at that time, she would have witnessed a greater tragedy than any which she had yet seen. 10. The night was stormy and dark. The rain was falling, and the ground in Alec's camp was heavy with mud. The faithful Swahilis whom he had brought from the coast chattered with cold around their fires, and the sentries shivered at their posts. It was a night that took the spirit out of a man and made all that he longed for seem vain and trifling. In Alec's tent the water was streaming. Great rats ran about boldly. The stout canvas bellied before each gust of wind, and the cordage creaked, so that one might have thought the whole thing would be blown clean away. The tent was unusually crowded, though there was in it nothing but Alec's bed, covered with a mosquito curtain, a folding table with a couple of garden chairs, and the cases which contained his more precious belongings. A small tarpaulin on the floor squelched as one walked on it. On one of the chairs a man sat asleep, with his face resting on his arms. His gun was on the table in front of him. It was Walker, a young man who had been freshly sent out to take charge of the Northeast Africa Company's most northerly station, and had joined Alec's expedition a year before, taking the place of an older man who had gone home on leave. He was a funny, fat person with a round face and a comic manner, the most unexpected sort of fellow to find in the wildest of African districts, and he was eminently unsuited for the life he led. He had come into a little money on attaining his majority, and this he had set himself resolutely to squander in every unprofitable way that occurred to him. When his last penny was spent, he had been offered a post by a friend of his family's, who happened to be a director of the company, and had accepted it as his only refuge from starvation. Adversity had not been able to affect his happy nature. He was always cheerful no matter what difficulties he was in, and neither regretted the follies of his past nor repined over the hardships which had followed them. Alec had taken a great liking to him. A silent man himself, he found a certain relaxation in people like Dick Lomas and Walker, who talked incessantly. And the young man's simplicity, his constant surprise at the difference between Africa and Mayfair, never ceased to divert him. Presently, Adamson came into the tent. He was the Scotch doctor who had already been Alec's companion on 2 of his expeditions, and there was a firm friendship between them. He was an Edinburgh man with a slow drawl and a porky humour, a great big fellow, far and away the largest of any of the whites, and his movements were no less deliberate than his conversation. "Hello there," he called out as he came in. Walker started to his feet as if he were shot and instinctively seized his gun. "All right," laughed the doctor, putting up his hand. "Don't shoot. It's only me." Walker put down the gun and looked at the doctor with a blank face. "Nerves are a bit groggy, aren't they?" The fat, cheerful man recovered his wits and gave a short laugh. "Why the dickens did you wake me up? I was dreaming of a high-heeled boot and a neat ankle and the swirl of a white-lace petticoat." "Were you indeed?" said the doctor with a slow smile. "Then it's as well I woke you up in the middle of it before you made a fool of yourself. I thought I'd better have a look at your arm. It's one of the most aesthetic sights I know." "Your arm?" asked the doctor dryly. "No," answered Walker. "A pretty woman crossing Piccadilly at Swan and Edgar's. You are a savage, my good doctor, and a barbarian. You don't know the care and forethought, the hours of anxious meditation it has needed to hold up that well-made skirt with the elegant grace that enchants you." "I'm afraid you're a very immoral man, Walker," answered Adamson with his long drawl, smiling. "Under the present circumstances, I have to content myself with condemning the behavior of the pampered and idle. Just now, a camp bed in a stuffy tent, with mosquitoes buzzing all around me, has allurements greater than those of youth and beauty, and I would not sacrifice my dinner to philander with Helen of Troy herself. You remind me considerably of the fox who said the grapes were sour." Walker flung a tin plate at a rat that sat up on its hind legs and looked at him impudently. "Nonsense. Give me a comfortable bed to sleep in, plenty to eat, tobacco to smoke, and Amaryllis may go hang." Dr. Adamson smiled quietly. He found a certain grim humor in the contrast between the difficulties of their situation and Walker's flippant talk. "Well, let us look at this wound of yours," he said, getting back to his business. "Has it been throbbing?" "Oh, it's not worth bothering about. It'll be as right as rain tomorrow. I'd better dress it all the same." Walker took off his coat and rolled up his sleeve. The doctor removed the bandages and looked at the broad flesh wound. He put a fresh dressing on it. "It looks as healthy as one can expect," he murmured. "It's odd what good recoveries men make here when you'd think that everything was against them." "You must be pretty well done up, aren't you?" asked Walker as he watched the doctor neatly cut the lint. "Just about dropping, but I've a devil of a lot more work to do before I turn in. The thing that amuses me is to think that I came to Africa thinking I was going to have a rattling good time, plenty of shooting, and practically nothing to do." "You couldn't exactly describe it as a picnic, could you?" answered the doctor. "But I don't suppose any of us knew it would be such a tough job as it's turned out." Walker put his disengaged hand on the doctor's arm. "My friend, if ever I return to my native land, I will never be such a crass and blithering idiot as to give way again to a spirit of adventure. I shall look out for something safe and quiet, and end my days as a wine merchant's tout or an insurance agent." "Ah, that's what we all say when we're out here. But when we're once home again, the recollection of the forest and the plains and the roasting sun and the mosquitoes themselves come haunting us, and before we know what's up, we've booked our passage back to this god-forsaken continent." The doctor's words were followed by a silence, which was broken by Walker inconsequently. "Do you ever think of rump steaks?" he asked. The doctor stared at him blankly, and Walker went on, smiling. "Sometimes, when we're marching under a sun that just about takes the roof of your head off, and we've had the scantiest and most uncomfortable breakfast possible, I have a vision. I would be able to bandage you better if you only gesticulated with one arm," said Adamson. "I see the dining room of my club, and myself seated at a little table by the window looking out on Piccadilly, and there's a spotless tablecloth, and all the accessories are spick and span. An obsequious menial brings me a rump steak, grilled to perfection, and so tender that it melts in the mouth. And he puts by my side a plate of crisp fried potatoes. Can't you smell them? And then a liveried flunkey brings me a pewter tankard, and into it he pours a bottle, a large bottle, mind you, of foaming ale. "You've certainly added considerably to our cheerfulness, my friend," said Adamson. Walker gaily shrugged his fat shoulders. "I've often been driven to appease the pangs of raging hunger with a careless epigram, and by the laborious composition of a limerick I have sought to deceive a most unholy thirst." He liked that sentence and made up his mind to remember it for future use. The doctor paused for a moment, and then he looked gravely at Walker. "Last night I thought that you'd made your last joke, old man, and that I had given my last dose of quinine. We were in rather a tight corner, weren't we? This is the third expedition I've been with Mackenzie, and I assure you I've never been so certain that all was over with us." Walker permitted himself a philosophical reflection. "Funny thing death is, you know. When you think of it beforehand, it makes you squirm in your shoes, but when you've just got it face to face, it seems so obvious that you forget to be afraid." Indeed, it was only by a miracle that any of them was alive, and they had all a curious, light-headed feeling from the narrowness of the escape. They had been fighting, with their backs to the wall, and each one had shown what he was made of. A few hours before, things had been so serious that now, in the first moment of relief, they sought refuge instinctively in banter. But Dr. Adamson was a solid man, and he wanted to talk the matter out. If the Arabs hadn't hesitated to attack us just those 10 minutes, we would have been simply wiped out. Mackenzie was all there, wasn't he? Walker had the shyness of his nationality in the exhibition of enthusiasm, and he could only express his admiration for the commander of the party in terms of slang. "He was, my son," answered Adamson dryly. "My own impression is he thought we were done for." "What makes you think that?" "Well, you see, I know him pretty well. When things are going smoothly and everything's flourishing, he's apt to be a bit irritable. He keeps rather to himself, and he doesn't say much unless you do something he don't approve of. And then, by Jove, he comes down on you like 1,000 of bricks," Walker agreed heartily. He remembered observations which Alec on more than one occasion had made to recall him to a sense of his great insignificance. It's not for nothing the natives call him thunder and lightning. "But when things look black, his spirits go up like 1 o'clock," proceeded the doctor, "and the worse they are, the more cheerful he is. I know, when you're starving with hunger, dead tired and soaked to the skin, and wish you could just lie down and die, Mackenzie simply bubbles over with good humor. It's a hateful characteristic. When I'm in a bad temper, I much prefer everyone else to be in a bad temper too. These last 3 days he's been positively hilarious. Yesterday he was cracking jokes with the natives." "Scotch jokes," said Walker. "I dare say they sound funny in an African dialect." "I've never seen him more cheerful," continued the other, sturdily ignoring the jibe. "By the Lord Harry," said I to myself, "the chief thinks we're in a devil of a bad way." Walker stood up and stretched himself lazily. "Thank heavens it's all over now. We've none of us had any sleep for 3 days, and when I once get off, I don't mean to wake up for a week. I must go and see the rest of my patients. Perkins has got a bad dose of fever this time. He was quite delirious a little while ago. By Jove, I'd almost forgotten." People changed in Africa. Walker was inclined to be surprised that he was fairly happy, inclined to make a little jest when it occurred to him, and it had nearly slipped his memory that one of the whites had been killed the day before, while another was lying unconscious with a bullet in his skull. A score of natives were dead, and the rest of them had escaped by the skin of their teeth. "Poor Richardson," he said. "We couldn't spare him," answered the doctor slowly. "The fates never choose the right man." Walker looked at the brawny doctor, and his placid face was clouded. He knew to what the Scot referred and shrugged his shoulders. But the doctor went on. "If we had to lose someone, it would have been a damned sight better if that young cub, Allerton, had got the bullet, which killed poor Richardson." "He wouldn't have been much loss, would he?" said Walker, after a silence. "Mackenzie has been very patient with him. If I'd been in his shoes, I'd have sent him back to the coast when he sacked McInnery." Walker did not answer, and the doctor proceeded to moralize. "It seems to me that some men have natures so crooked that with every chance in the world to go straight, they can't manage it. The only thing is to let them go to the devil as best they may." At that moment, Alec Mackenzie came in. He was dripping with rain and threw off his mackintosh. His face lit up when he saw Walker and the doctor. Adamson was an old and trusted friend, and he knew that on him he could rely always. "I've been going the round of the outlying sentries," he said. It was unlike him to volunteer even so trivial a piece of information, and Adamson looked up at him. "All serene?" he asked. "Yes?" Alec's eyes rested on the doctor as though he were considering something strange about him. The doctor knew him well enough to suspect that something very grave had happened, but also he knew him too well to hazard an inquiry. Presently Alec spoke again. "I've just seen a native messenger that Min Darby sent me." "Anything important?" "Yes." Alec's answer was so curt that it was impossible to question him further. He turned to Walker. "How's the arm?" "Oh, that's nothing. It's only a scratch." "You'd better not make too light of it. The smallest wound has a way of being troublesome in this country." "He'll be all right in a day or two," said the doctor. Alec sat down. For a minute he did not speak, but seemed plunged in thought. He passed his fingers through his beard, ragged now and longer than when he was in England. "How are the others?" he asked suddenly, looking at Adamson. "I don't think Thompson can last till the morning." "I've just been in to see him." Thompson was the man who had been shot through the head and had lain unconscious since the day before. He was an old gold prospector who had thrown in his lot with the expedition against the slavers. Perkins, of course, will be down for several days longer, and some of the natives are rather badly hurt. Those devils have got explosive bullets. "Is there anyone in great danger?" "No, I don't think so. There are 2 men who are in a bad way, but I think they'll pull through with rest." "I see," said Alec, laconically. He stared intently at the table, absently passing his hand across the gun which Walker had left there. "I say, have you had anything to eat lately?" asked Walker, presently. Alec shook himself out of his meditation and gave the young man one of his rare, bright smiles. It was plain that he made an effort to be gay. "Good Lord, I quite forgot. I wonder when the dickens I had some food last. These Arabs have been keeping us so confoundedly busy." "I don't believe you've had anything today. You must be devilish hungry." "Now you mention it, I think I am," answered Alec cheerfully. "And thirsty, by Jove. I wouldn't give my thirst for an elephant tusk." "And to think there's nothing but tepid water to drink," Walker exclaimed with a laugh. "I'll go and tell the boy to bring you some food," said the doctor. "It's a rotten game to play tricks with your digestion like that." "Stern man. The doctor, isn't he?" said Alec with twinkling eyes. "It won't hurt me once in a way, and I shall enjoy it all the more now." But when Adamson went to call the boy, Alec stopped him. "Don't trouble. The poor devil's half dead with exhaustion. I told him he might sleep till I called him. I don't want much, and I can easily get it myself." Alec looked about, and presently found a tin of meat and some ship biscuits. During the fighting, it had been impossible to go out on the search for game, and there was neither variety nor plenty about their larder. Alec placed the food before him, sat down, and began to eat. Walker looked at him. "Appetizing, isn't it?" he said ironically. "Splendid. No wonder you get on so well with the natives. You have all the instincts of the primeval savage. You take food for the gross and bestial purpose of appeasing your hunger, and I don't believe you have the least appreciation for the delicacies of eating as a fine art." "The meat's getting rather mouldy," answered Alec. He ate notwithstanding with a good appetite. His thoughts went suddenly to Dick, who at the hour which corresponded with that which now passed in Africa was getting ready for one of the pleasant little dinners at the Carlton upon which he prided himself. And then he thought of the noisy bustle of Piccadilly at night, the carriages and buses that streamed to and fro, the crowded pavements, the gaiety of the lights. "I don't know how we're going to feed everyone tomorrow," said Walker. "Things will be going pretty bad if we can't get some grain in from somewhere." Alec pushed back his plate. "And I wouldn't worry about tomorrow's dinner if I were you," he said with a low laugh. "Why?" asked Walker. "Because I think it's 10-1 that we shall be as dead as doornails before sunrise." The two men stared at him silently. Outside, the wind howled grimly, and the rain swept against the side of the tent. "Is this one of your little jokes, Mackenzie?" said Walker at last. "You have often observed that I joke with difficulty." "But what's wrong now?" asked the doctor quickly. Alec looked at him and chuckled quietly. "You'll neither of you sleep in your beds tonight. Another cell for the mosquitoes, isn't it? I propose to break up the camp and start marching in an hour." "I say, it's a bit thick after a day like this," said Walker. "We're all so done up that we shan't be able to go a mile." "You will have had 2 hours' rest." Adamson rose heavily to his feet. He meditated for an appreciable time. "And some of those fellows who are wounded can't possibly be moved," he said. "They must. I won't answer for their lives. We must take the risk. Our only chance is to make a bold dash for it, and we can't leave the wounded here." "I suppose there's going to be a deuce of a row," said Walker. "There is. Your companions seldom have a chance to complain of the monotony of their existence," said Walker grimly. "What are you going to do now?" "At this moment, I'm going to fill my pipe." With a whimsical smile, Alec took his pipe from his pocket, knocked it out on his heel, filled and lit it. The doctor and Walker digested the information he had given them. It was Walker who spoke first. "I gather from the general amiability of your demeanor that we're in rather a tight place." "Tighter than any of your patent leather boots, my friend." Walker moved uncomfortably in his chair. He no longer felt sleepy. A cold shiver ran down his spine. "Have we any chance of getting through?" he asked gravely. It seemed to him that Alec paused an unconscionable time before he answered. "There's always a chance," he said. "I suppose we're going to do a bit more fighting." "We are." Walker yawned loudly. "Well, at all events, there's some comfort in that. If I am going to be done out of my night's rest, I should like to take it out of someone." Alec looked at him with approval. That was the frame of mind that pleased him. When he spoke again, there was in his voice a peculiar charm that perhaps in part accounted for the power he had over his fellows. It inspired an extraordinary belief in him, so that anyone would have followed him cheerfully to certain death. And though his words were few and bald, he was so unaccustomed to take others into his confidence that when he did so, ever so little, and in that tone, it seemed that he was putting his hearers under a singular obligation. "If things turn out all right, we shall come near finishing the job, and there won't be much more slave trading in this part of Africa. And if things don't turn out all right, why then, I'm afraid the tea tables of Mayfair will be deprived of your scintillating repartee forever." Walker looked down at the ground. Strange thoughts ran through his head, and when he looked up again, with a shrug of the shoulders, there was a queer look in his eyes. "Well, I've not had a bad time in my life," he said slowly. "I've loved a little, and I've worked and played. I've heard some decent music, I've looked at nice pictures, and I've read some thundering fine books. If I can only account for a few more of those damned scoundrels before I die, I shouldn't think I had much to complain of." Alec smiled, but did not answer. A silence fell upon them. Walker's words brought to Alec the recollection of what had caused the trouble which now threatened them, and his lips tightened. A dark frown settled between his eyes. "Well, I suppose I'd better go and get things straight," said the doctor. "I'll do what I can with those fellows and trust to Providence that they'll stand the jolting." "What about Perkins?" asked Alec. "Lord knows. I'll try and keep him quiet with Coral." "You needn't say anything about our striking camp. I don't propose that anyone should know till a quarter of an hour before we start." "But that won't give them time." "No. I've trained them often enough to get on the march quickly," answered Alec, with a curtness that allowed no rejoinder. The doctor turned to go, and at the same moment George Allerton appeared.